Ahoy! Hashtag Zach here. Today I'm going to talk to you all about World War II on the Eastern Front of Europe. Fighting along the Eastern Front started about halfway through World War II, and it would go through the conclusion. It's really important to note just how huge and massive this front was. One, in terms of manpower, as it saw the largest conflict in history, even if you exclude the rest of World War II.
It was also an incredibly massive area, taking over 1.5 million square miles.
The origins of this conflict are largely ideological, as the German Nazis, who were fascists under Hitler, and the Soviet communists under Stalin saw each other as their mortal ideological enemies and wanted to do everything in their power to vanquish them. Many historians believe that a war between these two countries was virtually inevitable.
There would be some time before war, however, as most of Eastern Europe was divided into independent countries by the Versailles Treaty and would not take part, at least by their own will, in any war between Germany and the Soviet Union.
Then, in the late summer of 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany shocked the world with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the ambassadors from each of these countries to each other. They struck a deal where these two countries would have temporary non-aggression and divide Eastern Europe between each other, and actually help each other in the conquest of Eastern Europe, so that they could both expand. This was a horrible shock to the European democracies, as France, Britain, and other countries aligned with them were hoping that the USSR would stand with them against Nazi aggression, especially in Poland.
They eventually decided upon this line as the border between tyrannies of fascism and communism in Eastern Europe.
Then, for a time, the two dictators honored the non-aggression pact and went their separate ways. Hitler began waging war against Britain and France in Scandinavia and Western Europe, eventually driving the Allies out of both and having enormous success. However, they were stalled over the skies of England during the Battle of Britain. The Soviet Union suffered several horrible purges under Stalin's regime. Many of the best military officers and politicians and bureaucrats were killed off for Stalin's fear of being usurped in a coup.
And like I said earlier, the ideological differences between the two nations would eventually drive them to war, and Hitler was the one to initiate it. His dreams of establishing a 1,000-year Reich, using the great land in the east as Lebensraum, or living space, drove him to make the decision to attack the Soviet Union.
So, in the summer of 1941, that Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. It was delayed, though, because Germany had to help their Italian allies in southern Balkans as they tried to invade Yugoslavia and Greece, but Mussolini's Italian forces just couldn't handle it. So Germany had to delay its invasion by over a month to help the Italians.
The Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, which would see several million men storming into the Soviet Union. They would be divided into three main groups. Army Group North would go through the Baltic states and go for St. Petersburg, the largest port city in Russia, where they receive a lot of trade from, and could receive a lot of extra supplies from the Allies, unless the Germans cut it off. Army Group South would drive through and occupy Ukraine, a very resource-rich area that also had people who disagreed with the Soviet Union politically and could possibly join the Germans on their side. Army Group Center would drive to Moscow, the railroad hub in the center of the Soviet Union, making it the political, economic, and industrial heart of the nation, which would cripple the country's ability to wage war and force them to surrender.
The Germans initially enjoyed brilliant success as their battlefield tactics and overall strategy worked like clockwork at the start. They would launch encirclements by using blitzkrieg or lightning warfare. They would fly planes and tanks rapidly at enemy positions to get a little breakthrough, a hole in the enemy line, as opposed to attacking the entire thing. They would send all of their forces through this hole and go around behind, and then they would launch the attack at the front. And so that way they could catch a lot of prisoners without actually having to fight most of the Soviet forces.
By the end of the summer, the Germans had captured millions of Soviet soldiers.
This amount of prisoners is mind-boggling and almost unbelievable. It led almost everyone in the world to doubt that the Soviet Union could even last through the fall. However, this is when Germany would make a strategic blunder.
Because Army Group South was fighting through an area that was particularly mountainous, they had a lot slower progress, as it's a lot harder to advance through mountains than through the open fields of the rest of Eastern Europe. When Hitler saw this, he halted the advance of Army Groups North and Center and rerouted a lot of their best tank forces to Army Group South to help them advance faster. While this would lead Germany to have a decisive victory in the campaign in the South, occupying all of Ukraine in only another couple months, it would lead to both Army Group North and Center facing serious problems.
By the time the tank forces had returned to Army Groups North and Center, and they were pushing towards their goals of Leningrad and Moscow, they were held off in early December by the winter. This would prevent any further advance, as it led to freezing vehicles, frostbitten soldiers, and ruined supplies. And while the war would still go on the next year, and it was far from decided, it had prevented Germany from having a quick victory.
To make problems even worse for Germany, Japan did not help their ally by attacking Russia from the other side, and so the Soviet Union was able to bring all of their forces from the Far East in Asia over to help, and they were experts in cold weather fighting in Siberia. So when they arrived with the snow, they were able to counterattack against the Germans and take back some of their key defenses, throwing the whole line of combat into the air, as no one had a good place to anchor a defense.
The high command of German generals knew they needed to rethink their strategy for how they would fight this war. So they settled on this. Army Group North would settle into a siege around Leningrad and occupy the Baltic states, holding the line there. This would prevent any major battles, but hold in a defensive line so that the city would eventually surrender, at least according to plan, and the Soviets could not take back any ground there. In Army Group Center, they would hold the line just away from Moscow, as it was now far too heavily defended to take with an acceptable amount of casualties. And in the south, they would launch Operation Blue.
Operation Blue was driven by a desire that we in the modern world understand very well today: the need for oil. Nazi Germany was running low on oil supplies, as a lot of their supply was going to their defense of their west coast against Britain, and now the United States was involved in the war as well. So, Germany needed more supplies. In this, Army Group A would go along the Don River in the north and take the Star, where Stalingrad was. This would be as a defensive line along the river and serve as a line that the Soviets could not push through. Meanwhile, Army Group B would go down south and take the oil-rich fields of the Caucasus.
While this was an excellent plan, the plan was abandoned at the first sign of trouble, as when Army Group A had trouble taking Stalingrad, Hitler decided to send all of Army Group South into the city to try to take it, as opposed to what the generals suggested as merely holding the defensive line behind the city and continuing to take the oil fields. This blunder would not only prevent Germany from taking the oil fields, but it would result in the greatest disaster for Germany in the war, the Battle of Stalingrad. This resulted in the greatest battle in all of history with the most casualties, over 1 million in one battle. It would completely devastate the city and turn the tide in the East, as Germany would not launch another major successful advance into Russia for the rest of the war.
In a series of offensives nicknamed the Planets, because each of the attacks were named after a different planet from our solar system, the Soviets began pushing back and attempting to encircle Ukraine. By 1943, in the summer, the Germans knew they needed to launch some sort of offensive to try to prevent this.
This resulted in the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in world history. Thousands upon thousands of tanks were attacked from either side around the city of Kursk, where the Germans hoped to cut off a small bulge that the Soviets made into the line. This would result in German defeat, as they did not end up gaining any ground and lost a massive portion of their tanks.
By this point, we can see a notable shift in how the war is going, from runaway German successes to some modest gains by the USSR. Although this was initially due to the winter and to just the massive superiority in numbers that the Soviets had by bringing their massive military to bear, a lot of this newfound success in the Soviet military was due to one thing and one thing only: the United States. Not only did the United States attacks in North Africa draw away some of the best tank units from the Germans, but the United States was producing half of the world's military output and supply, and was sending a large portion of that directly to the Soviet Union in form of trucks, planes, resources such as food, and ammunition and guns as well. The Soviet Union was running off of the United States material.
The result of this aid really showed itself in 1944 with one of the most massive reversals of fate that military history has almost ever seen.
The Soviet Union launched Operation Bag Ration, which was an exact reversal of Operation Barbarossa that the Germans had launched 3 years earlier. It was over the same pieces of land and resulted in a mirror image of the results.
This is around the time the Soviet Union began discovering the concentration camps and the death camps that Nazi Germany operated, such as Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is where the Germans conducted the Holocaust, killing over 6 million Jews and 5 million other minorities. However, the Soviet Union reported this for very shady reasons, as although they were raising awareness and sharing with the world what exactly was going on, they used it as cover to conduct some of their own atrocities and war crimes.
Throughout 1945, the Soviets experienced massive military success, pushing in through all of Eastern Europe, and eventually, in the Battle of Berlin, taking the capital of Germany and leading Hitler to commit suicide. However, they did not just liberate the people of Eastern Europe from fascist rule, as they then imposed communist rule in creating a whole string of puppet states across Eastern Europe that would be under the tyranny of communism from Moscow in Russia.
And that concludes World War II on the Eastern Front. After 4 years passed, 7 million Germans and 20 million Soviets' lives lost, the battle between communism and fascism had been decided, and communism would reign in tyranny over Eastern Europe for over 4 decades.
Some effects of these campaigns that cannot be ignored is the weakening of Nazi Germany, as throughout World War II, over 80% of German forces were sent to the Eastern Front. This weakened the Axis powers to such a degree that the United States, supported by Great Britain and other allies, could easily push into France and Italy and eventually conquer both of the European Axis powers of Germany and Italy. This led to a rebirth of democracy and freedom in Western Europe, leading to a massive boom in prosperity, which we're still seeing the rise of to this day. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall at the end of the Cold War, This spread to Eastern Europe as well.
So there you have it, a brief summary of World War II on the Eastern Front. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Please comment, like, subscribe, and see you next time.